My name is Ren. I'm 34 and Omega, and I repair clocks that other people have given up on. For 8 years, every morning before I open the workshop, I've done the same small, useless thing. I take the brass carriage clock off the third shelf, the one that no longer keeps time, and I wind it forward to exactly 714. It doesn't run. It's never run again. I wind it there anyway, and then I go to work on the clocks that do. This morning, a man walked through my workshop door wearing a suit that cost more than my truck, and a signet ring on the wrong hand, and I knew who it was before I looked up. I knew by the way the air changed. I had not said his name out loud in 3 years. I was not going to start that morning either. Let me tell you what that clock actually stopped for. 8 years ago, I was 26, and I was bonded to a man who was going to be someone. Everyone said it like that, going to be someone, the way you talk about whether coming in. Callum Ashford had the kind of face cameras liked, and a father who'd been in the state legislature since before either of us could vote. I restored buildings. He was going to restore, or so his father's people put it in every speech that year, the integrity of this office. I used to sit in the back of rented banquet halls and watch him practice smiling at strangers, and I told myself it was fine, that a man could love someone and also want the world to know his name. I fix things for a living. I should have known better than to think a bond was something that couldn't break. My workshop sits behind an old textile mill I spent 2 years bringing back from ruin, brick by brick, beam by beam, the kind of work that rewards you slowly and never lies to you about how long it will take. There's a bench along the north wall lined with clocks in various states of repair, a ship's clock from 1911, a schoolhouse regulator with a cracked face, a cuckoo someone's grandmother swore was haunted. People bring me things they can't bear to throw away and can't afford to fix properly anywhere else. I charge fair prices. I finish what I start. It is, I have come to understand, the only part of my life I've been able to say that about. I have a son. Theo, he's 7, and when he's nervous he counts things under his breath, stairs, ceiling tiles, the seconds between when I leave a room and when I come back. He was doing his homework at the back table that morning, 4 rows of long division, counting each problem before he wrote the answer down, the way he always does when the workshop door bell rings and he doesn't recognize the sound of the footsteps that follow it. I should tell you that I almost didn't take the State House contract. My crew lead, a beater named Rosalie who has worked with me for 6 years and has never once asked me a question I didn't want to answer, told me the county was putting the old State House restoration out to competitive bid, $12 million, the kind of job that makes a career. She also told me carefully, in the tone she uses when she already knows the answer will hurt, that the project was being championed by a senator's office. She didn't say the name. She didn't have to. I took the contract anyway. I told myself it was the building. Government buildings from that era don't come along twice in a career, hand-laid limestone, original tin ceilings, a rotunda that hadn't seen honest light in 40 years. I told myself I was choosing the work. If you have ever told yourself you were choosing the work when you were really choosing to stand somewhere he might see you, you already know I was lying to myself the whole drive to the site. At the dinner where it ended, I remember more about the tablecloth than I do about his face. Cream linen, a small burn mark near the edge that someone had turned to hide the seams. His father stood to make an announcement about the endorsement, and Callum stood beside him, and somewhere in the middle of that speech, I have never been able to locate the exact sentence. The man I was bonded to became, in front of 200 donors, unmarried. No scandal, no cruelty spoken aloud. Just an omission so clean it took me 4 days to understand it had actually happened. He never introduced me that night. He had introduced me every night for 3 years before that one. I left the venue before the applause finished. I did not go home to wait for an explanation. Explanations, I have learned since, are for people who still believe there's a version of the sentence that makes it not what it was. I did not tell him about Theo. I want to be honest with you about that, because I've spent 8 years being honest with everyone except myself about why. I told myself it was protection, his, mine, ours. The truth is smaller and uglier than that. I didn't tell him because some part of me still wanted to see, just once, whether he would come looking without being told there was something to look for. He never did, not for 8 years. If this story is finding you at the right moment tonight, stay a little longer. There are more like it waiting. I raised Theo in the apartment above the workshop for the first 2 years, and then in the small house behind the mill, once the restoration business started paying its own bills. I learned to recognize a fever by the back of my hand before a thermometer confirmed it. I learned which counting meant he was scared and which counting meant he was only bored. I learned to love someone so much it stopped feeling like a wound and started feeling like the shape of my own hands. Nobody teaches you that grief and devotion can live in the exact same room without ever introducing themselves to each other. I found that out on my own the way I've found out most things. I did not watch Callum's press coverage. That's what I told Rosalie and what I told myself and what was not strictly true. I watched every appearance. I told myself it was to know where he was so I could avoid it. I was 34 years old and I still knew the sound of his voice on a live stream before I recognized the words. The State House smelled like dust and old varnish the morning I walked the rotunda with my crew, cataloguing the plasterwork that needed saving. Theo was at the back table with his math because school didn't start for another hour and Rosalie's shift didn't start until 9, and some mornings it was simply easier to bring him than to ask anyone else to. The door opened. I didn't look up right away. I was marking a crack in the plaster, the kind of hairline fracture that tells you a building's been quietly failing for longer than anyone admitted. The scent reached me before the footsteps did. 8 years, and my body still knew it before I gave it permission to. I looked up. Callum stood in the doorway of a building I was being paid to save, wearing his father's old signet ring on the wrong hand, the one I used to correct without thinking, back when I still had the right to reach for his hand and adjust something on it. He hadn't caught himself doing it wrong yet. I watched him not notice. "Ren," he said, just that. Like my name was something he'd been keeping in a drawer and hadn't opened in years, unsure if it would still work. Behind me at the back table, I heard Theo's pencil stop. I did not say his name back. Not yet. Some debts you don't pay on the first ask. "Senator," I said instead, and went back to marking the crack in the plaster, and did not turn around to see whether he was looking past me toward the table, toward the boy who had just gone very still and started, quietly, counting. 3 weeks later, same rotunda. Different kind of quiet. By then, Callum had learned the schedule of my crew the way a man learns a language he's decided he needs, not fluently, but enough to arrive when the building was busiest and I had the least room to ask him to leave. He came for what he called site visits. He came with his chief of staff sometimes, a sharp young beta named Priya who watched us both like she was trying to solve a math problem nobody had given her the full numbers for. Mostly, though, he came alone. He never asked about Theo directly. I want you to understand that. He wasn't a man circling a discovery he already suspected. He simply kept showing up in a building where a 7-year-old sometimes did his homework at a folding table near the scaffolding, and eventually the two things were going to occupy the same room at the same time. I knew it before he did. I'd known it since the first morning. I had stopped rewinding the clock to 714 that week. I want to say it was a decision. It wasn't. I simply forgot, twice, and the third morning I stood in front of the shelf with my hand out and could not make myself do it. And I didn't examine that too closely, because examining it too closely would have required admitting something I wasn't ready to admit at 7 in the morning with coffee not yet made. Theo has a habit that has nothing to do with counting. When he takes his shoes off, he lines them up at the exact center of whatever doorway he's standing in. Not to the side, not out of the way, dead center, laces tucked underneath. I have never once been able to train it out of him and stopped trying 2 years ago. Rosalie steps over them. My crew steps over them. It is, at this point, simply a fact about doorways in my life, the way some houses have a creaky third stair. Callum did not know this. He walked into the rotunda that Thursday afternoon, already mid-sentence to Priya about ceiling load calculations, and stopped hard enough that she nearly walked into his back. Theo's shoes were sitting in the center of the doorway. Small, scuffed at the toe, laces tucked under exactly the way he does it. I don't know what made him stop. I've turned it over since, and I don't think it was the shoes themselves. I think it was that they were placed with such specific, unthinking care, the care of a child who has never once been told to put his shoes somewhere else, because nobody in his life has ever needed him to be smaller than he is. He looked past the shoes. Theo was at the folding table, 12 feet away, doing spelling words, counting the letters under his breath the way he counts everything when a room has a new sound in it. C a T, 1 2 3, DOG 1 2 3. I watched it happen in Callum's face the way you watch weather arrive from a distance, slow and then all at once. Not the math of dates, something underneath the math. The counting. He knew that counting. He'd sat beside me during 3 heat suppressions in the years we were bonded. And every single time, without either of us naming it, I had counted seconds under my breath to get through the worst of it. And every single time, he had matched his breathing to my count without being asked. He was looking at a habit of mine, worn into a stranger's face. Ren. His voice had changed since the doorway 3 weeks earlier. Smaller. How old is he? I set down the level I was holding. I did not answer quickly. I want you to understand that the not answering quickly was not cruelty. It was that I had spent 7 years building a sentence for this exact moment, and now that the moment had arrived, none of the sentences I'd built were the right shape anymore. 7, I said. I watched him do the arithmetic. I watched him arrive in real time at the dinner with the cream tablecloth, at the endorsement, at the 8 months and 11 days between that dinner and the day I stopped answering his calls. If you have ever watched someone understand, all at once, exactly what they cost you, you know there is no dignified way to stand still for it. He didn't move. That was the dignity, I suppose, if there was any. He stood very still in a building neither of us had chosen because of each other, and he let it land. Theo looked up. Not because he'd heard the arithmetic, he was 7, he hadn't followed any of it, but because the room had gone quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when adults are having a conversation with their bodies instead of their mouths, and he is a child who has always been able to feel that shift before he understands its cause. "Who's that?" he asked me, not Callum. Me. He asked me the way he asks about strangers at the grocery store, mildly curious, already half back to his spelling words. I had 8 years to plan an answer to that question, and in the moment it arrived, all I had was the truth, offered small enough for a 7-year-old to hold. "Someone I used to know," I said. Callum did not correct me. I want to note that, because it would have been so easy for him to correct me, and 8 years earlier, I think he might have needed the room to know exactly who he was to me, the way he'd once needed a room full of donors to know exactly who I wasn't. He didn't. He stood in the doorway with my son's shoes at his feet and let someone I used to know be the truest thing said in the room. "Hi," Theo said, already losing interest, the way children do when adults fail to be interesting quickly enough. He went back to his spelling words. RUN 123. Callum's eyes didn't leave him. I watched a man who has given hundreds of speeches, who has learned to control every visible register of his own face for public consumption, fail completely to control this one. His jaw worked once. He looked down at the shoes he'd nearly stepped on and did not step around them the second time either, just stood there careful, like the shoes were something that deserved to be walked around and not simply avoided. He didn't ask to hold him. He didn't ask his name. I think some part of him understood, faster than I expected, that he hadn't earned either of those things yet, not on the strength of one accidental afternoon. "I have to go," he said finally, to me. Quiet, not the senator's voice, the other one, the one I hadn't heard in 8 years and had, somewhere underneath everything, been listening for anyway. He left without saying my name again. I stood in the rotunda a long time after the door closed, looking at the crack in the plaster I'd been marking before any of it started, and found I could not remember what I'd been about to write next to it. That night, after Theo was asleep, I went to the shelf and picked up the brass carriage clock. My hand knew the motion before my mind agreed to it, wind it forward, set it to 714, put it back. I stopped with my thumb on the winding key. I did not finish the motion. I put the clock back on the shelf exactly as it was, hands frozen where they'd been for 8 years, and for the first time since the dinner with the cream tablecloth, I let it sit there unchanged by my own hand instead of maintained by it. There is a difference between a wound you tend and a wound you simply carry. I did not know, standing in my workshop that night, which one I was choosing. I only knew I couldn't do the old motion anymore, and I didn't yet have a new one to put in its place. I did not sleep well. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, I found myself standing at Theo's door, watching him sleep the particular boneless sleep of a child who doesn't yet know his life changed that afternoon. And I thought about the way Callum had stood so carefully around a pair of small shoes, and I hated how much that had told me, and I hated more that I'd noticed it at all 2 months later. Late October. The rotunda finished ahead of schedule, which never happens, and which I've since decided was the building's way of telling me it was time to stop hiding inside the work. Callum did not disappear after that afternoon in the doorway, and he did not push either. That surprised me more than anything else he'd done. The man I remembered moved toward what he wanted the way weather moves toward a coastline, inevitable, total, no negotiation implied. This man asked Priya to route his site visits through Rosalie's schedule instead of mine, so I'd always know he was coming and could choose, each time, whether Theo would be there. Small thing. It cost him nothing to do and everything to think of. He never asked to see Theo again after that first day. He waited to be asked. I want you to understand how strange that was to receive from him. Waiting had never been a language he spoke fluently, not in the years I knew him, not in any speech I'd watched him give since. I think he understood, finally, that the last time he'd chosen for both of us without asking, it had cost him everything that mattered and cost me a name I didn't get to give my son until he was 7 years old. I noticed the second small thing 3 weeks after the first. I always notice. Noticing and forgiving are not the same skill, and it's taken me most of my adult life to stop confusing them. Theo's spelling folder had a broken zipper. Had for months, actually. One of those small domestic failures I kept meaning to fix and kept not fixing. Because there is always a clock or a beam or a client's cracked plaster that needs me more urgently than a 7-year-old's folder. I found it on the workshop bench one evening, zipper repaired, a small neat row of new stitches where the pull had torn free. Nobody in the workshop sews. Rosalie can barely manage a hem. I didn't ask Callum if he'd done it. I didn't have to. Some things you recognize by the carefulness of the work, the same way I can look at a 100-year-old dovetail joint and tell you which hand cut it. He'd fixed a folder zipper and said nothing about it, the way you fix something for someone when you don't yet have the right to say, I noticed you needed this. If you have ever loved someone the world made you legally, publicly deny existed, you know what it does to a person, watching them learn, quietly and without credit, how to be careful with the smallest things. It doesn't undo the dinner. It doesn't put the tablecloth back the way it was. It just tells you something about the man standing in front of the wreckage he made, and whether he's actually trying to build something out of it, or just standing there hoping the wreckage will forgive itself. I found him in the rotunda on the last day of the project, alone, running his hand along the restored plasterwork, the way you touch something you weren't sure was allowed to be beautiful again. You fixed the folder, I said. Not a question. I'd decided, walking over, that I wasn't going to make him confess to something small when there was something so much larger neither of us had said. He didn't turn around right away. The zipper, it wasn't hard. That's not what I asked you. Now he turned. 8 years had put grey at his temples that hadn't been there at the dinner, and something else, something harder to name, the specific exhaustion of a man who got the thing he sacrificed for and discovered, too late, that the ledger didn't balance the way he'd been promised it would. I don't know how to ask for anything from you, he said. I gave up the right to ask a long time ago. I thought, fixing something small and not saying why, I thought maybe that was allowed, even if the rest of it isn't. I have spent 8 years telling myself I would know exactly what I wanted to say to him if this moment ever came. I didn't. I stood in a rotunda I'd spent 4 months restoring, in front of the man who ended a bond over cream linen and never once looked for the reason I disappeared, and found that none of my prepared sentences fit the actual shape of what I felt. So I asked him a question instead. That was the choice. Not forgiveness handed over because he'd finally said the right thing. He hadn't, not really, not in any way a speechwriter would have approved, but a question. Offered because some part of me needed to know the answer before I could decide anything else. Why the ring? I said. Why do you still wear it on the wrong hand? He looked down at it like he'd forgotten it was there. You used to fix that for me. Every morning before I left for something, I never learned to do it myself. I think some part of me didn't want to. I felt something move through me that I did not immediately name. I named it a moment later. Not forgiveness, not yet, not that fast, not for a man who'd had 8 years and used none of them until a folding table forced his hand. What I felt was smaller and more honest than forgiveness. Recognition, the particular ache of watching someone still be, underneath everything he'd become, careless in exactly the one way you used to love catching him at. I reached over and moved the ring myself, left hand to right, I don't know why. It felt less like forgiveness and more like closing a door gently instead of slamming it, an ending done with care to something that had been left open and wrong for 8 years. That doesn't fix anything, I said. I know. He counts things when he's scared. You'll need to know that if you're going to be around him. Doorways, stairs, spelling words. It means he needs someone to slow down, not ask him anything yet. Callum's face did something I hadn't seen it do since before the dinner, something unguarded, something that had nothing to do with cameras. Okay, he said, just that. I did not invite him to dinner that night. I did not tell him he could see Theo whenever he wanted, or draw up an agreement, or any of the things a more efficient man would have arranged in that same conversation. I told him Thursdays. I told him Theo liked the science museum and hated being rushed and would need, probably, several months of Thursdays before he understood that this new person in his life wasn't going anywhere. Bittersweet is the only honest word I have for what came after. The Bond scar never fully faded. I still feel a faint pull on cold mornings, a phantom ache where something was severed instead of released properly. And I suspect I'll carry that the rest of my life, the way you carry a bone that was broken and reset slightly crooked. Callum and I did not become, again, what we were before the dinner. That version of us stayed exactly where it ended, cream linen and all. What grew instead was slower, warier, built by two men who'd both learned the cost of choosing wrong once and weren't willing to repeat it. He came to the workshop on a Thursday in December, the kind of grey afternoon that makes everything look older than it is, and found me at the shelf with the brass carriage clock in my hands. You never fixed that one, he said. He'd noticed it before, months earlier, though he'd never asked. I didn't want to. Why not? I looked at the hands, frozen at 714, the exact minute I'd walked out of a banquet hall 8 years earlier and become, for the first time, a person building a life around an absence instead of a presence. It was easier to keep something stopped than to find out it couldn't be fixed, I said. I opened the case. The mechanism was simpler than it looked, a broken mainspring, nothing I hadn't repaired 100 times in clocks belonging to strangers who'd never once been afraid of what the hands might do once they started moving again. It took me 11 minutes. Callum stood beside me the whole time and didn't say anything, which was, I think, the first genuinely correct thing he'd done since the doorway. The clock started ticking at 714 on a Thursday in December, 8 years and 2 months after it had stopped. I didn't reset it. I let it run forward from exactly where it had been frozen, which felt at the time like the only honest way to let a thing move again. Not erased, not pretending the stopped years hadn't happened, just finally, quietly, allowed to continue. Theo's shoes were in the center of the doorway when Callum left that evening. He stepped around them, careful as always, and for the first time, I saw him smile at them instead of just avoiding them. A small, private thing, the smile of a man learning the shape of a life he doesn't yet fully belong to, but is finally, patiently, being let into. The clock is still running. Some mornings I forget to notice it's moving at all, which I've decided is its own kind of ending, the good kind, the kind where a wound stops being the first thing you check every day and becomes, instead, just a clock on a shelf, doing what clocks are for.